It is a recurring tragedy in human history that we underestimate the people or the nations we believe to be beneath us. Arrogance blinds us, and when arrogance becomes the lens through which we see, we distort reality itself. America, in its vast power and global dominance, believed that India was peripheral, a secondary player, an afterthought in the great geopolitical chess game. But when you underestimate another, you do not only miscalculate their strength, you also reveal your own weakness. Underestimation is an act of pride, and pride is a fatal sin because it disconnects you from reality. When you decide someone is incapable of rising, you simultaneously cease to prepare for their rise. And that is the precise moment you plant the seeds of your downfall. The act of dismissing others is not a sign of power, but a sign of blindness. It is the blindness that great empires fall into, time and again. Human beings make this mistake in their own lives constantly. You look at the quiet, diligent colleague in the corner and you think he doesn't matter. You dismiss the small business that just started down the road and say they'll never compete. You look at the student who struggles today and assume he will never surpass you tomorrow. But here's the truth. Potential hides in places where arrogance never bothers to look. Nations operate under the same principle. India was dismissed, underestimated, and treated as though it were always destined to be second. Yet potential is not always visible to the arrogant eye. It grows silently, like a tree underground, before it bursts into undeniable existence. When you think someone is small, you give them the very space to grow without interference. That is the paradox. When America tried to harm India, it was not simply a clash of nations. It was a clash of perceptions. America perceived itself as the inevitable victor, the ultimate architect of global order. But the world is far too complex to bend to one nation's will indefinitely. Underestimation is costly because it blinds you to complexity. Reality is structured in layers that the arrogant never take the time to see. India's culture, its resilience, its intellectual depth, and its collective determination were underestimated. And when all those invisible forces align under pressure, they generate strength that surprises even the one who possesses it. Nations, like people, often do not know the full measure of their strength until they are forced to discover it. The same truth applies to your personal life. How many times have you been underestimated? Perhaps by family, by peers, by institutions that never thought you could amount to much. And in that underestimation lies a strange opportunity. It grants you invisibility while you prepare. When people don't take you seriously, they don't block your path as vigorously. They don't sabotage you because they assume you are harmless. And in that space you can grow. That is what India did. It grew in the shadows of dismissal until the day came when its strength could no longer be ignored. Underestimation creates vulnerability for the arrogant, but it creates opportunity for the underestimated. Now consider the psychological danger of arrogance. When you dismiss another, you tell yourself that you are beyond the possibility of competition. But this is delusion. Every time in history a nation, an empire, or even an individual has fallen, it is because they came to believe their dominance was permanent. Rome fell, the British Empire declined, and even the Soviet Union collapsed not because they were weak initially, but because they assumed their power was unquestionable. America, in underestimating India, repeated this archetypal mistake. It assumed that one narrative, its own narrative, would last forever. But narratives shift, power shifts, and the underestimated eventually demand recognition. You can see this principle in interpersonal relationships as well. A father who dismisses his son as incapable of greatness fails to see the latent fire in him. A teacher who writes off a struggling student plants a seed of resentment that may one day return as brilliance. A company that dismisses a competitor as insignificant may find itself obsolete within a decade, Underestimation creates the perfect storm for surprise. And surprise is dangerous because it destabilizes the arrogant while energizing the underestimated. It shifts the balance in ways that no prediction or strategy can control. This is why humility is not weakness, but a form of deep wisdom. It keeps you open to realities you cannot yet perceive. When America underestimated India, it also underestimated the psychological drive of a nation that had long endured struggle. Struggle creates a memory, and memory creates resolve. India's historical experience with colonization, with poverty, with rebuilding itself from fragments of chaos, gave it a depth of resilience America could not measure. To underestimate resilience is to misunderstand what truly creates strength. Strength is not measured by immediate wealth or weapons or temporary influence. Strength is measured by how deeply a people believe in their own future, and how much suffering they are willing to endure to reach it. That is why India rose when it was dismissed. It had already suffered too much to be easily broken. Think about it in terms of the individual once more. If you've endured pain, rejection, hardship, and humiliation, you've already built within yourself a capacity that others cannot see. They only see your present circumstances. They do not see the years of quiet suffering that have hardened your spirit. And when the day comes that you rise, they will call it sudden, unpredictable, even miraculous. But you will know it wasn't sudden. It was forged in every moment they underestimated you. Nations rise in the same way. What looks like an overnight transformation is often the product of decades, even centuries, of invisible preparation. So, when you underestimate someone, or some nation, you aren't just miscalculating them, you are also setting yourself up for a future humiliation. Because reality has a way of correcting arrogance. The world punishes blindness, it humbles the proud and raises the overlooked. America, in its treatment of India, learned that the underestimated are always dangerous, precisely because no one expects them to win. And when they do, their victory is magnified by the arrogance of those who doubted them. It is not just a material win, it is a psychological triumph. Adversity is the great paradox of human development because it both threatens and strengthens at the same time. When America attempted to harm India, the intention was to weaken, to destabilize, to impose a kind of external control. But history shows us repeatedly that oppression often produces the opposite effect. A person under pressure discovers resilience they never knew they possessed. A nation under attack discovers unity that had long been dormant. The attempt to crush becomes the catalyst for rising stronger. This is not accidental, it is woven into the very structure of life. Struggle is the mechanism through which character is forged, both individually and collectively. Without it, there is no depth, no spine, no ability to endure. When we face challenges, we often complain, resent, or despair. We ask ourselves, why is this happening to me? Why does life demand so much suffering? But here's the profound truth. Adversity is not simply an obstacle, it is an instructor. It teaches you to become sharper, tougher, more disciplined, more capable of bearing responsibility. A person who avoids adversity at all costs becomes weak and fragile. Likewise, a nation shielded from struggle becomes complacent and decadent. But when you are confronted with trials, you must either collapse or rise. And it is in that decisive moment of confrontation where transformation occurs. India, under pressure, did not collapse. It found within itself a deeper reservoir of power. The human psyche is structured in such a way that resistance strengthens us. Consider the gym. You only build muscle by placing stress upon your body. Without that resistance, without that pain, there is no growth. The same principle applies to nations and cultures. When America tried to undermine India, it created resistance, and resistance gave India the opportunity to grow stronger. This is why oppression rarely works long-term. it unintentionally empowers the oppressed. It grants them the struggle that forges unity and determination. When the world tells you that you cannot rise, that voice becomes the very fire in your veins to prove otherwise. Adversity functions as a terrible gift, wrapped in suffering, but filled with potential. We see this pattern in personal life over and over again. The child who grows up poor often develops grit, resourcefulness, and a hunger for success. The individual who faces rejection after rejection learns endurance and self-reliance. The person who has known heartbreak discovers depths of empathy that comfort others. Adversity strips away illusions and forces you to confront reality directly. And when you confront reality, you sharpen your mind, harden your spirit, and clarify your goals. This is why people who suffer meaningfully often surpass those who live comfortably without struggle. They have been tested by fire, and that fire has transformed them. Comfort can dull, but adversity awakens. Nations are collective reflections of this individual principle. India's history of colonization, exploitation, and imposed hardship could have destroyed it permanently. But instead, those centuries carved resilience into the cultural DNA. A nation that has endured suffering for generations carries a kind of memory, a deep well of psychological preparedness for future trials. When America attempted to harm India, it underestimated this memory of endurance. It assumed that a nation long familiar with pain would be easily broken again. But in fact, the opposite was true. Suffering had already taught India how to survive, and now it was prepared to thrive. Struggle had become its training ground. This is why we must not curse every difficulty that comes our way. Life is suffering. This is a fundamental truth recognized by the greatest thinkers across history. But within that suffering lies the possibility of transcendence. If you turn away from adversity, you refuse the very mechanism that could make you whole. If you confront it, accept it, and bear it with courage, you transform yourself into someone more capable, more powerful, and more meaningful. The same applies to nations. Those that run from challenge collapse into chaos. Those that face adversity directly rise above it. That is how India converted harm into strength. There is an archetypal story hidden here as well. Every hero in myth faces a trial: Hercules, Odysseus, Christ. They descend into suffering before they emerge victorious. This is not a coincidence, it is a reflection of reality itself. Growth requires sacrifice, and sacrifice is inseparable from suffering. India's trial, like the trial of the hero, was imposed upon it, but the choice remained: fall or rise. In rising, it followed the oldest human story, the story that suffering does not have to destroy you, but can instead elevate you. That story is as true for nations as it is for individuals. But here's the paradox that few recognize. Adversity reveals what was always there. When you are tested, you do not magically create strength out of nothing. You uncover the strength that suffering had been preparing within you all along. India did not suddenly become resilient when challenged. The resilience had been formed through centuries of hardship. America's attempt merely forced that resilience into the open. This is why we must not run from suffering, because it awakens parts of us that comfort can never touch. Hidden capacities emerge only when tested by fire. The test is painful, but the discovery is priceless. And so, we learn a dangerous but liberating truth. When someone tries to break you, they may unintentionally be building you. When life places its heaviest burdens upon your shoulders, it is simultaneously offering you the possibility of becoming someone strong enough to bear them. This is why adversity builds strength. It is not a mistake of the universe, but a fundamental design of growth itself. To be human is to suffer, but to suffer consciously is to transform. To be underestimated, to be attacked, to be suppressed. These are the conditions that, paradoxically, create greatness. India stands as proof of this, and so too can you. Power is intoxicating, but when it is divorced from responsibility, it becomes fragile. America, in its dominance, believed it could exercise influence without wisdom, without restraint, without recognizing the weight of responsibility that true power demands. This is the same psychological trap that individuals fall into when they achieve status or success too quickly. They assume the position itself grants permanence, but the truth is harsher. Power is not permanent. It is lent to you by reality, and reality always demands accountability. Without responsibility, power rots from the inside. It collapses not because it was challenged externally, but because it eroded internally. Nations fall for the same reason that people fall. They mistake temporary advantage for eternal strength. When power is used merely to dominate, it creates resentment in those who are oppressed. That resentment doesn't disappear. It accumulates, it grows, it waits patiently. History is littered with empires that crumbled because the people under their control finally rose against them. America, in attempting to control India without true regard for responsibility, underestimated the long-term effects of its actions. The use of power without responsibility might produce short-term gains, but it always generates long-term instability. Responsibility means understanding that your actions ripple outward, shaping the world beyond your immediate desire. If power is used selfishly, the ripple becomes destructive. If used responsibly, it creates stability and growth. The choice is not optional. It is woven into the very fabric of power. Look at the family, the smallest unit of civilization. A father may have authority over his children, but if he uses that authority merely to impose fear or control, the children will eventually despise him. That authority will collapse the moment they are strong enough to resist. But if he uses his authority responsibly, providing guidance, discipline, and protection, then his authority endures, because it is rooted in trust. Nations function in the same way. America sought dominance without trust, control without care, influence without accountability. But influence without responsibility is unsustainable. Eventually, the people, or the nations under pressure, rebel against it. That rebellion is not accidental. It is the natural correction of misused power. Power is always a double-edged sword. It can build or it can destroy. What determines which side of the sword you wield is responsibility. Responsibility forces you to see beyond yourself, to recognize that what you do now will have consequences tomorrow. Without that recognition, power becomes blind. Blind power lashes out, manipulates, and exploits, believing it is untouchable. But reality does not tolerate blindness forever. Sooner or later, consequences arrive, and they do so mercilessly. This is why every tyrant eventually falls. They may rise quickly, they may appear unstoppable, but their lack of responsibility sets a timer on their collapse. Responsibility is what stabilizes power. Without it, power is already decaying. America believed that economic strength, military dominance, and cultural influence were enough to secure its supremacy, but these are not sufficient without responsibility. Wealth can vanish, armies can be defeated, and culture can decay. What endures is responsibility because it grounds power in meaning. Meaning gives purpose, and purpose sustains strength through hardship. When America used its power to harm rather than uplift, it undermined its own foundation. In contrast, India, though weaker at the time, began to root its rising strength in responsibility toward its people, its future, and its identity. That contrast made all the difference. Power guided by responsibility grows. Power detached from responsibility implodes. This is not just a geopolitical truth, but a personal one. Many people dream of success, of influence, of wealth. But when they attain it without cultivating responsibility, they self-destruct. The celebrity who squanders fame, the entrepreneur who abuses employees, the politician who manipulates the people, they all share the same fate. Power without responsibility collapses into chaos. If you want to hold on to power, you must bear responsibility equal to or greater than that power. That is the balance of reality. You cannot cheat it. Responsibility is the price you pay for power's longevity. Without paying it, you are merely borrowing strength for a short time. Consider also the psychological burden of responsibility. It is heavy, demanding, and often painful. That is why so many reject it, preferring to exercise power without the weight of accountability. But it is precisely this weight that stabilizes you. A king who understands his responsibility rules with caution and foresight. A leader who rejects responsibility rules with arrogance and short-sightedness. America, in forgetting responsibility, acted like the latter. It used its influence recklessly, believing consequences would never catch up. But history is merciless in teaching that responsibility cannot be denied. Deny it long enough, and it will return with interest. The same lesson applies in relationships. Imagine someone who gains trust, but betrays it because they see only their own advantage. The betrayal might grant them temporary power, but it destroys the foundation of the relationship. Trust is fragile, but it is also the only true stabilizer of power. Nations, too, depend on trust between rulers and citizens, and trust between allies. When America acted without responsibility toward India, it broke trust. Once trust is broken, rebuilding it takes decades, sometimes generations. This is why responsibility is not optional. It is the very glue that binds power to stability. Without it, collapse is inevitable. If you want to understand why civilizations rise and fall, you must look at their relationship to responsibility. Civilizations rise when they balance power with accountability, when leaders recognize that authority is a sacred trust, not a personal toy. Civilizations fall when they mistake dominance for permanence, when they abuse the vulnerable without understanding that resentment will eventually overturn the oppressor. America's failure in its relationship with India was not just tactical, it was moral. It forgot that true power is not about imposing will, but about bearing responsibility. Without that moral foundation, every empire eventually eats itself from within. And so we return to the fundamental truth. Power without responsibility is fragile. It appears strong, but is hollow, like a tree eaten away by termites. One day, the storm arrives, and the tree falls not because of the storm's strength alone, but because the rot was already inside. America's misuse of its influence revealed this fragility. Responsibility, on the other hand, strengthens from within. It creates resilience, stability, and trust. And when these exist, power can endure for generations. But without them, even the mightiest nations collapse into dust, just as individuals without responsibility collapse into despair. The triumph of meaning over might is one of the deepest lessons written into human history. Nations that define themselves only by wealth, military capacity, or temporary dominance inevitably fade, because these things are finite. Meaning, however, is not finite. It grows stronger when challenged. It deepens with sacrifice, and it cannot be easily destroyed. America sought to measure its supremacy in raw material power, in economic leverage, in weapons, and intimidation. But India, though weaker in appearance, carried something more enduring, a sense of purpose rooted in culture, in identity, and in destiny. When people believe their lives and their collective existence are meaningful, they can outlast powers far stronger than themselves. Meaning gives a nation its soul, and a soul cannot be conquered with might alone. This truth is mirrored in the lives of individuals. A person who has no sense of meaning may appear successful for a while, but they collapse the moment suffering arrives. A person who believes their life has purpose can endure almost any amount of suffering without losing themselves. This is why Viktor Frankl, who survived the horrors of the concentration camps, wrote that those who have a why to live can bear almost anyhow. Nations are no different. If they lack a why, their strength crumbles under pressure. If they possess a why, no level of external oppression can break them. India endured centuries of colonization and exploitation because its meaning was embedded in its culture, its spirituality, and its belief in a future beyond oppression. Might is seductive because it offers immediate results. With force, you can bend others to your will, silence opposition, impose your order. But force always decays because it lacks the capacity to inspire genuine loyalty. Loyalty built on fear disappears the moment fear weakens. Loyalty built on meaning, however, lasts across generations. People will sacrifice comfort, wealth, and even their lives if they believe they are serving something meaningful. That is why armies motivated by belief often defeat armies motivated by mere payment. Meaning transforms individuals into something greater than themselves, uniting them into a force that cannot be calculated in material terms. India discovered that meaning, and America underestimated it. Consider the psychological difference between living for yourself and living for a cause. The person who lives for themselves alone can be easily corrupted, bribed, or broken. But the person who lives for a higher purpose develops a resilience that appears almost supernatural. Their suffering becomes tolerable because it is directed towards something greater. Their discipline becomes bearable because it is infused with purpose. This is why meaning triumphs over might, because it transforms suffering from something destructive into something creative. A person or nation with meaning is not merely surviving suffering, they are using it as fuel for growth. That is an unstoppable force. History confirms this principle again and again. The Soviet Union possessed immense military might, but it lacked meaning that resonated with its people. Its ideology turned hollow, and the empire collapsed from within. Meanwhile, movements rooted in genuine meaning, be it spiritual, cultural, or national, outlasted oppression far stronger than themselves. India's independence movement was not built on weapons, but on meaning. The belief that freedom was not just a political demand, but a moral necessity. That belief turned ordinary men and women into extraordinary actors in history. The material strength of the empire could not extinguish a fire rooted in meaning. This is why the search for meaning is not optional, either for individuals or nations. Without meaning, power becomes destructive. Without meaning, wealth becomes empty. Without meaning, influence becomes manipulation. Meaning gives direction, and direction gives endurance. You can withstand chaos if you know why you are enduring it. You can rebuild after collapse if you know why rebuilding matters. America's mistake was believing that might alone could sustain supremacy, but might without meaning is brittle. India's victory was to root its rise not merely in material gain, but in a sense of moral and cultural destiny. That made its position more secure than brute force ever could. We see the same in families. A family that exists only to pursue wealth may accumulate riches, but when crisis arrives, those bonds shatter. A family bound by shared values, traditions, and purpose endures hardships without breaking. The shared meaning becomes the glue that holds them together. Nations are extensions of families, magnified across millions of people. India endured hardship because its meaning was not lost. Its traditions, its stories, its identity kept people connected even when material circumstances were dire. That invisible thread of meaning proved stronger than America's visible displays of might. Meaning also demands sacrifice, and sacrifice is what gives meaning its weight. To live for meaning means to give up comfort, ease, and sometimes safety. That is why it cannot be easily replicated by those who live only for power. Power seeks to consume, meaning demands that you give. Power imposes itself externally, meaning transforms you internally. The transformation is what sustains you when external force threatens you. A nation willing to sacrifice for its identity is a nation that cannot be subdued indefinitely. India's willingness to endure struggle in the name of something larger gave it the strength to rise against overwhelming odds. At the level of the individual, this means you must discover what you are willing to suffer for. If you suffer only because life imposes suffering on you, then you are a victim, tossed about by chaos. But if you suffer for a purpose, you are transformed into a participant in something larger than yourself. Your suffering acquires dignity, and with dignity comes strength. This is why meaning is not simply a philosophical idea, but a practical weapon against despair. It is the foundation of resilience. Without it, you collapse. With it, you rise. That is the choice every person and every nation must make. The triumph of meaning over might is inevitable because might belongs to the present, but meaning belongs to eternity. Power shifts, wealth changes hands, armies dissolve, and empires fall. But meaning outlasts them all because it is tied to identity, to truth, to the human capacity to find purpose in suffering. America's might was impressive, but it was not enough. India's meaning was quiet, invisible, but indestructible. That is why meaning triumphed, and that is why it always will.